Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the national headquarters of the Theosophical Society in America. My name is John Chianchosi. I'm the Director of Public Programs. At this time, I'd like to ask that you turn off or at least silence your cell phones and other noise-making electronic devices. This evening's lecture is being streamed live, and so we will be having many friends watching through the internet, and I welcome those people as well. As you know, the Theosophical Society promotes study, meditation, and service. We encourage open-minded inquiry into the world religions, philosophy, science, and the arts. And we have a deep respect for the unity of all life. Our goal is to help people explore the spiritual path so as to arrive at a deeper understanding regarding the wisdom of the ages. Also, we feel that this wisdom is not limited to any one tradition, and thus we offer programs from a variety of traditions. Please do take one of our program catalogs, in which you'll find the programs being offered through to the end of March. The new season for Spring-Summer catalog is coming out soon. Look forward to it. However, all those programs are also listed on our website, and there you can register for those that are of interest to you. This evening, it does give me pleasure to be able to introduce a good friend, Richard Smoley, who is known to all of you. That's why you've come here this evening. He works here at the Theosophical Society and has been working here for considerable time. But when he does these lectures and many of his other teachings, it's not as necessarily part of his job, so he's doing it as an offering, and we appreciate that. Richard is the editor of the Quest magazine, which is one that you've probably received yourself if you're a member, and if you did not receive it, become a member and we'll send you one. However, we do have copies of those magazines. They come out quarterly. It's the magazine of the Theosophical Society in America, and it's beautifully done with very interesting and informative articles. That we have those in the library, the bookshop, and as I said, members receive those as part of the membership benefits. In addition to being the editor of this magazine, Richard is also quite an accomplished author, very prolific. He has written over 10 books, and his latest one, which was released, I think this year, was it? Or November last, yeah, not long ago. A Theology of Love, Reimagining Christianity through a Course in Miracles. And we do have copies of that book here available this evening if you'd like to pick one up and get it autographed. But this evening, Richard is going to speak on the topic of Atlantis, then and now. Please join me in welcoming Richard Smoley.
Well, thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to see you all here, to hear me talk about the legendary lost continent of Atlantis, about which most of you have heard at least something. And one thing we will consider is to what extent it actually was legendary. Now, the idea of a lost continent that sank into the ocean 50 years ago was laughed at. Nobody took it seriously. No one could possibly believe this. Things didn't work that way. Well, let's take a look at option one here. United States in 2100. This is not political blues and reds, although it almost looks like it. This is what is going to be submerged by certain models by the year 2100. It's about 80 years from now. What was 80 years ago? 1940. So all of this is going to be submerged. Oh, what does that include? Well, it includes Seattle, San Francisco, LA, San Diego, New Orleans. I don't know exactly where Houston fits in here. but certainly New Orleans, Miami, all of Florida, Washington, our nation's capital, New York, Boston, so on. So here are any number of potential lost civilizations. Now, do I know that this is going to happen? No. This is a model. As I think you probably have already realized, this is not going to be a lecture on climate change. And the simple reason for that is I don't know much more about climate change than you do. But the idea of a whole civilization just sinking is not quite as ridiculous as it was a couple of generations ago. It's something that everybody has to take really quite seriously. So the idea that there was a continent that sank, and when it sank, supposedly, we'll get to. The idea that it sank is not quite as ludicrous as it was very recently. Now, where does the Atlantis myth come from? Well, it comes from him. Plato, whom you've all heard of, certainly one of the greatest of all philosophers, some would probably say the greatest. The philosopher Alfred North Whitehead said that all of Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato. And whether that's so or not, in a way, all of the lore about Atlantis is a footnote to Plato. Because this is where we first read about it. And he wrote 2 dialogues. They're late. Maybe the last decade or so of his life. One is called the Timaeus and one is called the Critias. And in these, he described the lost continent of Atlantis. Now, Plato's writings are mostly dialogues. So he's never speaking in his own voice. So when someone else is speaking as a character, you always have to ask to what extent Plato himself is saying this and to what extent he's putting words in someone's mouth for the sake of a discussion. In this case, let's see, what do we have next here? How is that supposed to happen?
It's just got one forward and one back button. Harry will check.
Yeah, Harry. Yeah, good. Thanks, Harry. So these are dialogues on Atlantis. And one of these, this character is mentioned, Solon, who was a great Greek legislator and poet. And he was a collateral ancestor of Plato's. And in this story, Solon took a trip to Egypt. Now, Solon lived that era, so let's say around 600 BC. These dates are very approximate. The Greeks were not very good at keeping track of this kind of thing. He went to Egypt, and he talked to a priest in Egypt, and this priest said, I'm not going to read this, but there have been many destructions of mankind arising out of many causes. The greatest have been brought about the agencies of fire and water and other lesser ones by innumerable other causes. Now, here's something. Now, by the way, you remember a single deluge only, but there have been many previous ones. Now, the Greeks had a flood myth, very much like the one in the Bible. It's remarkably similar to the one in the Bible. In fact, the flood myths around the world are all remarkably similar to one another in a very weird way, ranging from Indians in South America to Polynesians to the Chinese, of course, to the Bible to Africa. And you really have to ask why this flood myth is so universal, far more so than just about any other. That, however, is another thing that is not a topic of the lecture tonight, because it's another huge thing. But there were many previous ones. And again, going back, which I guess I can't do. The little one is good. Now, many destructions of mankind ran out of many causes. Again, 250 years ago, when the Western world believed that the Bible was historical, nobody would have agreed with that. Why? Because the Bible, like Greek myth, mentioned one flood only. But this time scale is much more broad. So, and here's a description of Atlantis. Again, you can read it. I'm not going to read it out loud. But there was this continent. Now, the legend is very elaborate because, according to Plato, Atlantis tried to dominate the whole Mediterranean world. And it was the Athenians who stopped them. And since Plato and Solon were Athenians, of course that was a source of great pride. Yeah, Athenians were very proud of their city for reasons you can easily understand. There's a lot more to this. I'd like to go back for something. Here's a funny little detail. This name had a rather unsavory reputation in the Athens of Plato's time, because after the Athenians lost the Peloponnesian War in 404 BC, the Spartans were actually rather nice about it and didn't destroy the city and enslave all of its inhabitants, which was pretty much standard practice at the time. They just let them go. But they set up, the Athenians set up a kind of a lawmaking council called the 30, because they were 30 of them. And the leader was Critias, who was Plato's uncle, by the way. And it rapidly turned into a bloodthirsty junta. And lots of people were just done away with. Finally, about a year later, they got the 30 to step down on condition of being granted amnesty. So they wouldn't be prosecuted for all of the things they'd done. Why is this of interest? Well, Critias, like Plato and his circle, were all students of Socrates, who's so famous a philosopher that all the other philosophers before him are simply called the pre-Socratics. Well, you remember that Socrates was put to death in 399 BC for corrupting the youth of Athens, right? Well, this didn't mean pederasty, which was a perfectly accepted and normal practice in those days, whatever you think of. Well, good for the boy to have an older man take an interest in him. I suppose they thought that way. I don't know. But he was not talking about corrupting sexually. He was talking about corrupting their ideas about government, and they couldn't get to Critias because he had amnesty. So having Socrates put to death for corrupting the youth of Athens was a way of getting at him. So it was not, usually you all know the story of the death of Socrates, again, yet another not the subject of this lecture, but the idea is that he was arrested and put to death because of his religious beliefs or his ideas or something. No, this was a totally political thing, because Socrates, like Plato, like Critias, did not like the Athenian democracy. They hated the democracy. They thought it was awful. Plato thought it was awful too. His republic is not a republic in our sense of the word. That's a side detail, but of course, but it is extremely interesting in that, it's a major moment in the history of Western thought, and it's often misinterpreted. Well, why am I bringing it up here? Well, Critias is the narrator or a major narrator in these two dialogues. And it's Critias that tells the story. Now, Critias was Plato's uncle, and, as I said, Solon was a collateral ancestor. So, this may be an old family tradition. Plato is writing this, couple of 250 years later than this story about Solon supposedly took place. But we could be dealing with an authentic family tradition that was handed down. So something like this could have happened. All right. Here it is. Here's a map. This is a map by one Athanasius Kircher, who is a Jesuit polymath of the 17th century. And this is island of Atlantis, Africa, Spain, the Atlantic Ocean, America. This is right. This gets really interesting. This is just simply says the location of the Isle of Atlantis, which sank in the ocean a long time ago, according to the thought of the Egyptians and Plato's description. Why did he put America in? Well, look at this. I flipped Kircher's drawing. You know why? Because the original had south at the top. So this is upside down, but it's a little easier for us to imagine because, well, here's Spain, here's Africa, here's America. So this is Kircher's description. A map, I mean, map makers can be quite imaginative. Do you know there's like some island in the Caribbean that no one has ever been able to find? And they've decided, or at least one article I read suggested, that it never existed. That map makers could kind of put fake islands in to see who is copying their maps. Now, why you would want to put, deliberately misleading information in your own map is a question that, yet again, we don't have to get into. So, the Atlantic was navigable, which is an interesting point, which might get back to. The pillars of Heracles are the Straits of Gibraltar. The island was larger than Libya, which was what the Greeks called Africa and Asia put together, and was the way to other islands. And from these, you could go to the opposite continent, which surrounded the ocean. This could be called a boundless continent. Right? As I've told you, this was written in 360 BC. So this tradition knows that there were the Americas on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, which nobody else did. There's no reference to this anywhere that I've ever seen in classical literature. So you're starting to think, well, how much is this really just a legend and how much of a tradition of general truth is it? Here's the boundless continent. I mean, he didn't, it's kind of a sloppy view of America because although Kircher lived in 1680 or so, certainly knew what a map of America looked like, but Plato didn't, so he didn't really feel any particular desire or need to make it look like that. And all Plato says is it's truly a boundless continent. So we don't have a lot of descriptions of that. So when did all this happen? According to, again, the Timaeus, 9,000 years ago. From Solon's time. So you add your numbers up and you get to 9600 BC. According to this dialogue, Atlantis sank in 9600 BC. Again, these are very, very round dates. People did not have calendars or think in terms of, they didn't even have numerical calendars. Each city had its own calendar. They said when so-and-so was archon of Athens, this happened. And as long as you had the archon list, you kind of had an idea. But people didn't think in terms of decades and centuries. Well, let's look at geology. The Quaternary era was 206 million years ago to the present. We're still in it. And the Quaternary era is characterized by glacial periods, which last 100,000 years, and interglacial periods, which last between 10 and 15,000 years. The last glacial period ended around 11,700 years ago. It's not entirely reassuring to see that we're probably at the end of this interglacial period. And I have heard it suggested, it's definitely a minority opinion, but I have heard it suggested that what we're calling global warming is actually a prelude to a coming ice age. That's why I'm not a climate change skeptic, if that's troubling anybody too bad. But I prefer to call it climate change rather than global warming, because who knows if it couldn't flip. Those scientific models work with what they know already, and there's a lot they don't. But anyway, we're at the end of this, so it was 11,700 years ago. Okay, it's the end of the Ice Age, 9,700 BC, because you have to subtract 2,000 years, because it's been 2,000 years since the birth of Christ, right? What do you get? 9,700 BC. Atlantis sank in 9,600 BC. Those, given, as I said, the incredibly approximate dating that we're working with here, this is really remarkable. You know, it's like, wow, there could well have been, that could have happened, because there was land that was submerged at the end of the last glacial period. Here's one. Well, take a look at this. There are lots of maps like these. They're all rather, I'm sure they're all rather approximate. All of this light green land was land then during the Ice Age, and the dark green land is what's land now. This is not from some crackpot, you know, alternative historian. This is pretty much what people believe, with no doubt various differences in detail. And let's see, what have I got next? Oh, here's one. Here's one that's kind of interesting. Britain in those days was a peninsula and not an island. And there's this territory there called Doggerland. The British Channel the English Channel was a river. The Irish Sea was a river. Dogger comes from some Dutch fishing term, which I don't really remember, but in any case, there was this land there. You know, this was the land above sea level at 8,000 BC, you know, which was about like a little later than Atlantis. So we're talking about the idea that there was a lot of Europe 10,000 years ago, which is very, very short in geological time, that was above the water. And to go back to this, all right, well, here are the Pillars of Heracles, right? This was supposed to be beyond it. So where could Atlantis have been? Well, maybe like around here, somewhere. I'll get to that more specifically. I'm pretty sure this is the island of Madeira, which was above the ocean then and now. I mean, there are other curious details. Now, to go back to this, the Atlantic was navigable in those days. That is 9600 BC. And there are ancient sources that say you couldn't really navigate in this area beyond the Pillars of Heracles or the Straits of Gibraltar because of the mud shoals there. So, and we're talking about, well, Aristotle said this, and Aristotle was Plato's pupil, so, you know, pretty much the same time. So, conceivably, the sea levels have dropped even since those years. So the idea that there is some civilization here Oh, by the way, they fought the Athenians. Athens is maybe over here, I don't know, for control of this area. Well, it was all land then. Today it's the Mediterranean Ocean. So what's that all about? Again, Doggerland. Oh yeah, here's a thing about Doggerland. Sea levels, and the line began to tilt in an isostatic adjustment as the huge weight of ice lessened. So that's starting to look like, something sinking. Again, by the way, I'm not suggesting that Doggerland was Atlantis. I'm simply saying that this is a much more established kind of previously above the ocean that later sank. And another little thing here. I don't know much about this, but look. Now, this is not the time of Atlantis, but some of this was just kind of swamped by a tsunami that flooded everything around then, which is obviously geological information. And this kind of brings us to another kind of important point about this, which is until very, very recently, like maybe 100 years ago, scientists thought that the continents were really pretty stable. But some crackpot came up with this idea called plate tectonics. And everybody laughed at it. They thought it was the most ridiculous thing. Because he said, well, there are all these plates, see, on the Earth, and they kind of shift, and they move around. And over geological periods, they move apart, they come together. When they bump up against each other, or they scrape against each other, like the San Andreas Fault in the San Francisco Bay Area, we have earthquakes. The earthquake belt in the Pacific Rim is because of various plates that meet at that point. And this crackpot theory is now widely accepted. I don't know. I don't know if the guy lived to have it ever accepted or even remotely accepted, but sometimes that just doesn't happen. The point of all this is, until not so long ago, scientific thought believed everything kind of happened, either didn't happen or happened over an enormous period of time. But we're now starting to see, and again, this seems to be standard theory, that, there are cataclysms. There's like, as in the famous bestseller, there's a tipping point, right? All of this starts to melt and everything starts, suddenly, all of it crashes into the water and the land shakes and gets disrupted because all this ice isn't on it anymore. And that is kind of a cataclysmic theory of geological history. And again, this is much, although kind of novel, many destructions of mankind. So, and this leads me into another side point that's also very important. As you know, a lot of the esoteric traditions, traditional, talk a lot about climate, about these cataclysms and these lost civilizations. Modern science really doesn't want to hear much about it. And we have to ask ourselves, well, is this just because of some prejudice that, nothing happened before this point, nobody did anything? I mean, the general idea is, well, writing, as we know, it was invented around 3000 BC in Egypt and Sumeria. So there aren't any written records before that. So there's kind of an assumption that everything before that was utterly, primitive and that people were like totally barbaric. It's just that we don't have any written records. We don't have any written records that survived. Because if you wrote on paper or wood, which I think they did in some areas, it wasn't going to make it. So we have to start thinking in terms of there are these lost civilizations, and they are legendary, but we start to have to ask ourselves how much of this legend has some basis in truth. Here's another thing, and this is the exact opposite of modern day thinking. There is no old opinion handed down among you by ancient tradition. In those days, the antiquity of an idea, the fact that it went back, was more of a source of validity rather than its novelty or its likeliness of, getting some genius a Nobel Prize. And we're the exact opposite. We just assume that all these old traditions are rubbish. There's probably a middle ground there. And, it leads one at least to think we have to take some of these stories somewhat more seriously. As I said, I don't think Doggerland was it. And again, the shallows due to mud. So where is Atlantis? Well, here's a contemporary kind of topographical map. And let's see, where are we? Well, here's Portugal, so the Straits of Gibraltar around here. And there's this thing around here called the Ampere Seamount Chain. I'm sorry, the Horseshoe Seamount Chain. The Ampere Seamount is just one of it. And here's the island of Madeira, which apparently is a lovely vacation destination, I've been told by friends. Where would I look for Atlantis if I were going to find? I would probably look somewhere around here. Now, I mean, to my knowledge, I don't know whether there's anybody's looked or in any serious way, but if it were going to be anywhere, it might be around here. And what evidence would we find? Now, again, this is a very long quote, but Thucydides, who was, I don't know, I guess he was the age of like Plato's parents, I suppose, so it was that time. He was the first, he wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War. He was the first man to think about archaeology that we know of. Because here, he's thinking about what Sparta, the city of the Lacedaemonians, would be like, and nothing left of its ruins. And he said, well, actually, it's just kind of, there's really not very many impressive buildings there. It's just kind of like a bunch of little villages, because the Spartans were, as I think you can probably easily surmise, extremely Spartan. But they, they ruled a good part of the Greek world. But if you just went by their ruins, and I don't know, I've never heard anything about any ruins of Sparta. I imagine they are as spare as Thucydides thought. You would think there was nothing there. So even if no ruins are found, even if nothing magnificent is found, as is said, the absence of proof is not the proof of absence. And although, the Atlanteans, they're often envisaged in a kind of science fiction-y way, like they're kind of like ancient Greeks with temples who somehow had airships or something like that, which may have nothing to do with anything. It's quite conceivable that they were very sophisticated without being technologically sophisticated. What example would I cite from the present day? How about Tibet? Tibet in its Lama period, now I'm not going to talk about the Chinese business because it's, again, just too much. But if you read descriptions of Tibet from like 100 years ago, it was, incredibly impoverished, incredibly impoverished. All they really had to eat was tea, yak milk, and kind of flour. They were very, very poor. But their technological sophistication was very little, yet their psychological sophistication was actually pretty great. So you could have a civilization that was very advanced in certain ways, and very primitive in others. And one of the legends about Atlantis that is definitely found in theosophical writings, as well as in the channeled work of Edgar Cayce, is that the Atlanteans were punished by the gods for misusing mystical powers. I mean, maybe we're going to be punished today for misusing technological power. It's a question that at least should cross people's minds. By the end of the Critias, Zeus decides to punish the Atlanteans for their wickedness, and then he says, "Here is what we will do." And that's where the dialogue ends.
Next season.
You know, a lot of the greatest works of classical literature are not finished. Like Thucydides, like this book, he just stopped. It's just, I mean, you know, what he wrote is great, but he didn't go to the end of the war. He just stopped. Why? Who knows? Very likely he probably just died. Virgil's Aeneid, which is kind of considered to be the great work, was also unfinished. And he wasn't even happy with it. He just told his literary heirs to burn it. But they didn't. They pulled it together and published it, and it's one of the foundational texts of the West. Anyway, so it just ends, the Critias just ends there. What Plato thought is unclear. Here's a potential new Atlantis. It's really fascinating to see, and if you go online to like reputable news sources, practically every day, you can see some story about something like this. Well, this is a place in the Philippines that is obviously sinking. You know, I think I was reading about one island that was sinking, and it got so bad that all their pets had to learn how to swim. There's a future Atlantis. Here's another real possible future Atlantis. Ever hear of the Maldives? Well, here they are. They're the string of islands in the Indian Ocean with a population of about 500,000. And if things keep going the way they are, they're all going to be underwater in 80 years. Again, these are scientific projections, but they are scientific projections. They're not, crackpot things, even though the crackpots, as you've seen already, sometimes turn out to be right. So in any case, we have to start thinking that, yeah, there maybe was such a place. Could it be found? Well, maybe. Archaeology as we know it today started with this German businessman called Heinrich Schliemann, who got another crackpot idea. In his day, all the scholars and learned opinion said that the Homeric poems were just pure legends. They were just pure fiction. But Schliemann said, no, I really think there was a Troy. And you know how he found it? He looked where Homer said it was. You can go online and see the ruins. He found several layers of Troys, only one of all of which had been destroyed, only one of which was probably the city that Homer wrote about. So again, we have to start being a little humbler in just dismissing all sorts of things that don't fit in with our preconceptions. And this is very much a problem of the learned world. There's certainly a huge amount of lore about Atlantis beyond that. Now, I was once told in person by the legendary medicine man Rolling Thunder that the Cherokees, he was part Cherokee, were descended from the inhabitants of Atlantis. I mean, I can say for a solid fact that Rolling Thunder told me that. Whether there is such a Cherokee legend or whether this legend reflects anything is quite another matter. But there's certainly a lot of lore around Atlantis. And again, as the theosophical literature suggests, they were punished for abusing psychic powers. They had powers that allegedly we don't have. And then, of course, the story goes on from there. There's certainly one of those books over there. Let's see if I can hit it. I think it's that one, Atlantis and the Antediluvian World. That was written by an American congressman in the 19th century. And a lot of his argument is the enormous similarity of various things like, for example, pyramids on both sides of the Atlantic. How good his argument is, I don't really know. I haven't read the book since I was 12, but he does pull together a lot of things that should lead us to question. And then we have this flood myth. What is that about? The flood myth is so ancient that some have argued that it goes back to the time when the whole human species lived in Africa, like tens of thousands of years ago. Which would make it a little more plausible, because if you were living in a small part of Africa, there could well have been a flood in which just about everybody was wiped out except for a couple of people. That's extremely speculative, of course, but that is a very universal legend. My own feeling is that, yeah, there was probably some kind of primordial event like that, and in later memory, it was kind of conflated with all of the other destructions of humanity that took place in between, possibly even the one that ended the last ice age. But all of this is very speculative. And I think speculation is legitimate. The only real danger with speculation is that you can suddenly be somewhat bewitched by your own theory and decide, well, so this is the way it must be. It's better to take it with a lighter touch, I think, okay, this could have been. When I say something is speculative, or when I say something that I admit is speculative, it means this all fits with what known evidence we have, but it would take a lot more evidence that we don't have to really prove it. You can say certain things about Jesus in the New Testament, and you can say certain things, a certain number of things you can speculate about, but if you don't have, the Jerusalem newspapers from AD 33, you're not going to be able to prove this or disprove it, and you have to just bracket it in that way. And I think this is a very useful and legitimate way of thinking about all this lore. While we're in the Indian Ocean, some of you who are theosophically learned will have heard of Lemuria, which is a lost continent supposed to be somewhere around here. And this was originally posited because there were lemurs, these monkey-like creatures here and here. So they figured there must have been a continent that spanned it so they could have traveled. Now, with plate tectonics, well, this area was once closer to that, and the lemurs some lemurs stayed on this side, some stayed on the other. But that was taken as by the Theosophists as another civilization. Now that is also based in legend, the legends of the Puranas of India, which spoke of a continent, and these are very ancient traditions, somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. What was it called? It was called Lanka. And it's probably some connection with the fact that they renamed this island, which used to be called Ceylon, as Sri Lanka. So that is another set of legends and traditions, which of course I don't go to. There's a man named Churchward wrote some books in the 30s about a lost continent of Mu in somewhere in the Pacific, using something like the. It's really fascinating stuff, and although it's very, very speculative, I think it's valuable simply to consider the possibility that things are not always as we think they were. I like journalism, for example. Various times I've read journalistic account in newspapers and whatnot, a couple of times even about me. And Sometimes they completely said the opposite of what I said. And then you sort of have to think, well, gee, did they just do a bad job on me, particularly for, because somebody was hungover or something? Or do I have to wonder if all of the news stories I'm reading do not contain some element of the same inaccuracies? Which leads us into the vast arena of, which is definitely not something I want to touch on, fake news and whatnot. But the records of what things were and what actually happened is always going to be a little different. And I think that's true about whatever event you happen to read about today. And you may be upset about something in the news that may have nothing to do with anything. You may be completely wrong about the thing you're most upset about. That's happened to me. Which is good news for you, because it means, let's not take our little upsets about, you have one set of villains, the other people have the other set of villains who happen to be your people, and we know what that is. But it's well not to take this quite as seriously as people are inclined to do. In any case, so I think that's pretty much where I want to leave it. There's certainly a lot more discussion. Edgar Cayce, by the way, said that Atlantis, kind of a part of Atlantis that had stayed above the ocean, was the Isle of Bimini in the Caribbean. If you're really old, you'll remember that Bimini was the vacation home of a rather notorious congressman named Adam Clayton Powell. But that's trivia from when us senior citizens were young. So anyway, let's stop here. If you have questions or thoughts, well, we'll leave it there. Any questions or thoughts? Yeah.
Just, I'll bring you the microphone.
Yes. How long did it take Atlantis to sink? Was it something that happened and then went down in an hour or so? So it didn't take years or centuries?
Overnight. Again, according to Plato.
Overnight.
It was like a day and a night, I think is the way he described it.
What would cause that? Just to go down like that? I mean, that's different than the map you showed us. The map that you showed us, which is more like 80 years.
Well, go back to this. Again, it goes back to the cataclysmic theory and the tipping point. Something can be slipping for a long time, and then it finally falls. Have you ever happened? Like some picture in your house. It's not really on the nail right, and it's stayed on forever and ever, and then for God knows what reason, it just falls down one day. I would imagine it would have been something like that, or at least that is one possible answer to your question.
Richard, you mentioned theosophical teaching on this. Could you expound on that a little bit? And are there any compendium books that gather up all the various lectures and writings on Atlantis from theosophical teaching?
There's some over there. The best overview is this. The best overview of it is this book by Jocelyn Godwin called Atlantis and the Cycles of Time. This is a scholarly, because he is a scholar, view of all of this. And he draws it in. It's called Atlantis and the Cycles of Time by Jocelyn Godwin. It's a bit dry, but it's accurate, and it is fairly comprehensive. Some of those other books are there too. The Theosophical Teachings. The best general guide to theosophical teachings I know is a book called The Divine Plan by one Jeffrey Barborka, because it takes all of the stuff that's in Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine and talks about it in a coherent and organized way. So I would look to that if you wanted theosophical teachings specifically. And theosophical teachings, which I barely touched on, are really quite different. And by those teachings, and Edgar Cayce is somewhat the same way, Edgar Cayce had some interface with theosophy, is that the whole destruction of Atlantis was over a much longer period than even we're talking about. And that the part that Plato talks about was just like the very tail end of a very long process. That, is really starting to get into areas that, would be very hard to prove one way or the other. And of course, the Theosophists have this very, some perplexing to some theory of root races, different kind of strata of humanity. And the Atlanteans, I think, were the fourth. I think we're the fifth root race, right? The word, just using the word race at this point, just infuriates everybody. And suddenly people start accusing of all the kind of wildest nonsense, which has happened with Theosophy. But that's the Theosophical view, at least in a sketch or two.
Thank you, Richard. I also believe that when an idea has been around for so long that we don't even know where or when it originated, that there's probably some truth underlying it, even if we don't have physical evidence of it. In terms of if Atlantis disappeared overnight, an earthquake and a tsunami, I don't know very much about geology, but it seems to me that could wipe something out that quickly.
Again, I'm not saying that's how it happened, but I am saying that that's what Plato said how it happened. And, yeah, it's possible. And there's enough in his account that's like, well, I don't think he's making these things up in this particular case. Now, one thing that's curious about Plato is that in his dialogues, he has inserted what are called myths. That's what scholars call them. And for example, at the end of the Republic, there's a long kind of near-death experience by a soldier who almost gets killed but doesn't, because he comes back to tell the tale. And it's an elaborate description of the afterlife, including, by the way, a discussion of reincarnation. Now, Plato made up that story, probably, but it also probably reflects the teachings of the mystery religions of his time. And so where does this come in? Again, it's a question one has to ask. Now, if you're talking to the typical philosophy professor at the typical university, even if they're a specialist in Plato, it's something that usually they don't want to like bother about or think about. It's all just, well, I don't know, it's some sort of eccentricity of his or something. But I think it's not really a very fair way of evaluating, because in a lot of ways, these myths, like the one in the Republic, are kind of the capstone of the work, and they're almost the point he's leading up to. So just to say he threw this in as kind of his own eccentricities is, I think, short-sighted.
In the areas that you say that the maps show where Atlantis could have been, has there been any exploration underneath the sea?
My impression is that there's been some, but nobody has found anything. That's a general impression from just reading some things. I couldn't cite that. It would make sense that somebody went looking for Atlantis, but I don't think anyone has found anything that could really be linked with it.
Yep. Richard, this is a very interesting perspective with all the land masses and everything, but what about the punishment for misuse of technology or misuse of spiritual powers? Is there anything that we can, for some reason I thought that's what you were going to talk about, is like, mapping that onto our time. And then have you also, and my second question is about the dating of the Sphinx, that it supposedly was, has been more or less proven, but again, I don't know if archaeologists accept it, but one archaeologist that Colin Wilson wrote about dated at around the same time, about 10,000 BCE.
Yeah. Well, with the Sphinx, the controversy has to do with this, because the Sphinx is eroded, but people have kind of taken samples of it or photos of it and showed it to geologists and specialists, and they've said this is water erosion, not sand erosion. And Egypt was around 6,000 BC or thereabouts. It was kind of like a wetter savanna kind of climate than it is now. So the theory is that if it is water, then it really has to be a hell of a lot older than the 2700 BC date that's usually given. And again, I mean, Egyptologists are again very, very often narrow-minded in their thinking. According to them, Egyptian civilization sprung up overnight in 3000 BC. Suddenly there are all these. Well, there has to be a little more to the story than that. I'm not saying I know what that other part of the story is, but with that particular case, I would think, well, if there was climate change, and there's been climate change in the lifespan of the human race, as we've already seen, and Egypt was a savanna at one point, probably traces of this earlier civilization are somewhere out in the desert where nobody thinks to look. I mean, that's, again, an option. As far as the punishment goes, well, that is, again, a long-standing motif, that the gods were angry. There's a flood motif in Sumeria, the myth of Utnapishtim. And why did the gods decree this flood? Because there are too many people and they're making too much noise. It was kind of, the humans were becoming kind of noisy neighbors. The Greek epic cycle. Why did the Trojan War start? Well, there are all these, the judgment of Paris, and you all know the myths. But it started out because Zeus decided there are too many people in the world. So Zeus decided to start the Trojan War. That's from the Greek epic cycle. So there is always a sense of the gods deciding, hey, enough is enough. Certainly the Bible has the same thing. The flood is flat out a punishment for human degeneracy. Now, are we going to look at this in a contemporary light? Well, we might, in that we can adapt it to a present-day thing. Are the gods going to punish us for, shall we say, desecrating the environment? Well, maybe not. Maybe it doesn't really kind of come down that way. But if you abuse something enough, whether it's your kind of like mystical psychic powers or your capacity to burn fossil fuels, it's going to come back to haunt you. And I think that's kind of the core of the message, which in ancient times was thought in terms of the punishment of the gods. Although I have to say, this is just a gut reaction that I've had every time that some new cataclysm or tsunami or whatever hits. All I can think is like, wow, the earth gods are mad. Just a visceral response.
No. Get this gentleman first.
Do some articles allude to the fact that Atlantis was a more advanced civilization than we are now?
Yeah.
Do you have any theories on that?
Not other than that I've already said, because advancement is very different kinds. And frankly, let's put it this way. A really advanced civilization would make much more focused and disciplined use of mental powers than we do, because our civilization can barely begin to admit that they exist, and in most cases don't. So if you were, and thoughts do have power. You can, this is one fundamental occult teaching, and you can train your mind to, enhance the power of thought. So what if Atlantis was more advanced in this way, which again might not mean they had fancy temples or anything like that. That's at least one possibility. I think it's very, very important not to make the modern mistake of equating technological advancement with advancement per se. For example, I think it's quite clear that our technological advancement now had better be met really fast with an advancement in moral development, or things are going to be even worse than they are now. We're up here. There's quantum computing going on, and Walgreens has an app that can pinpoint where you are in the store. So you can, a little coupon will ping to tell you that Crest is $1 off. That's advanced. But are we morally advanced enough to use this wisely? The whole lesson of Atlantis, at least according to most of the traditions, was that they weren't, and that, that is, I think, the lesson I think I would, at least draw for our time. Actually, I'm incorrect. Walgreens does not have that app. They developed it, but people found it too intrusive, so they just let it go. This is, anyway.
If there's no sign of Atlantis, then how do you know it existed? And the other thing is, what kind of society did they actually have? And technically speaking, and in relation to these so-called mental powers, just how advanced were they?
It's all speculative.
So nobody knows.
Because to start with your first point, none of this amounts to proof that there was such a place as Atlantis. I'm not saying this. This is what I'd called speculative earlier. That is to say, everything I've given points to the possibility of a place called Atlantis, more or less when and where Plato said it was. It doesn't prove it. If you go away thinking that that's what I said in this lecture tonight, you would be wrong. I'm not saying it proves it. It's very indicative and suggestive. As what kind of society they had, I think there are lots of guesses about it. Edgar Cayce. Oh, is that? Oh, by the way, here's my book, Supernatural. And it actually has an article on Atlantis in it, which actually answers a lot of these questions. And there's more in it than I was able to deliver tonight. But I think Casey's thing was that the Atlanteans had bred these kind of semi-human creatures, and they were kind of abusing them for sexual and other purposes, and that was kind of one of the things that brought them down. Again, no, there's no proof of this. I will add, however, that another element of traditional teachings is other races. That is not to say black, Caucasian, and so on, but other races that preceded us. And that, too, has been demonstrated. What is it? According to the reports I've read, we the average person today has 5% Neanderthal genes. And then they came across this totally different race of humans called the Denisovans, because it's found someplace with that name in Siberia, who are apparently taller than we are, and their genes really only have survived, and for whatever reason, on the Polynesians. So, there are these legends of these different races, some of them giants, like the Denisovans. Again, these folk memories probably do reflect something. And another important point is the reliance of contemporary scholarship on written records is based on the assumption that all oral tradition is just hearsay. The thinking is, it's like the telephone game. You sit around and you whisper something and it comes back to you in a completely wrong way. Well, there is that element of it, but people did make an enormous, and particularly in traditional societies, they made an enormous effort to pass down the traditions and knowledge of the people. And you basically had to learn it. There were no books, so you had to be the book. How well did this work? Well, you've certainly heard of the Vedas, the Sanskrit sacred texts. Well, from linguistic evidence, they were probably composed around 1500 BC. Some people would say earlier. But they weren't really written down until 1000 AD. So these texts were preserved, including the method of chanting them, which there's a traditional method of chanting them, was preserved orally, perfectly accurately for 2,500 years. All of which is to say that these supposedly ancient traditions, these ancient legends, these folk tales of these primitive peoples may have been dismissed a little too callously.
The font of questioning.
Yeah. What I don't understand is if you have the game of telephone, phenomenon, then how could they keep something accurate through the centuries, by all this chanting? Wouldn't they go off kilter with that as well?
Well, these are like rigorous traditions. And then they basically started with small children and trained them for years and years and years. And they weren't trained in anything else. And if you had been that rigorously trained and you trained the next generation that rigorously, it's possible. Whereas the game of telephone is, it's just an idle thing. I mean, a gossip is really just kind of an idle thing. And people have a lot of interests just for the sake of enjoying it, if nothing else, and distorting it. But if you have a totally different attitude toward spoken knowledge, oral tradition, you'll have different results. I think Plato himself said that it was regrettable that writing had been invented because it would really deplete and reduce the power of human memory. And like India is much more memory-oriented than we are. Like Dhananjay, who is here sometimes, he's professor of statistics, among other things. He's from India. And he said, they had to memorize all the logarithms. You can calculate, or you can look them up in the exams, but you memorize them because it helps you get through the exam faster. So that's a very different attitude. Today, memory as a mental power is not very well cultivated because there's this idea that, well, as for thinking and memorying, our computers will do that for us. So, anyway, as for thinking, our computers will do that for us. So here's my book, Supernatural, both for you here and people in the astral airwaves of the web, and I suggest that you check it out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. And we do actually have both books there, A Theology of Love and Supernatural. If you'd like to get a copy and get it signed, this is your opportunity. I just want to mention two upcoming events. One is on Saturday afternoon. We invite you to join Susan Cass for a transformative dream work, an experiential workshop. So it's she does a lot of work with dreams and the meaning of dreams. And it's not that she's going to tell you what your dream means. It's an exploration of how to work with dreams, to understand your own dreams. So that is from 1 to 3:30. If you'd like to join in, go to our website and register for that. Then Thursday next week, we'll have with us again on a yearly tour, Lama Glenn Mullen, and he will be speaking here on Thursday evening, the Bodhisattva Ideal in Today's World. He is also teaching a weekend retreat that starts Friday next week and goes through Sunday. And if you're interested in either attending certainly the lecture is very entertaining, please come, tell your friends. But if there's anyone who's interested in the retreat and would like to or wants to know more about it, go to our website and you can see a bit of a write-up for that. And there's the schedule that will be for the weekend. If you're interested, you can register. Thank you all for coming this evening. Please stay and have some refreshments. Grab a book, get it signed. Ask some more questions. You can ask as many questions as you like now, Richard. Thank you so much. Okay.